please join me in welcoming Mr. Joseph Pearce.
Well, good evening. Well, I'm giving two talks over the next 2 days. Obviously this talk this evening and then a talk tomorrow morning before heading back home. It's good to be in Wichita. I'd never been to Wichita at all until about 5 weeks ago, and then I came and gave a talk at an Inklings conference, a talk in a Lewis conference for the 8th Day Institute. And I'm back now, and I think I'm coming back at the end of January, and I'm coming back again in April, so now I can't stay away. So I managed to not come to Wichita for 52 years of my life, and now I'm coming back 4 times in about 6 months, which is fine because I'm actually getting to like the place. And I'm going to take 2 different approaches. So the talk tomorrow is going to be much more ad lib. I'm just going to, from very scanty notes, but I thought for the keynote address, I'd like to actually be a bit more formal. So I'm actually going to read the talk to you this evening. So it's the liturgy and the second spring, and I wanted to begin. I sort of have a habit, hopefully it's a good one, of defining terms. So I'm not going to define liturgy, but the second spring, and many people here maybe don't know what the second spring is. Well, it gets its name from a famous sermon preached by Blessed John Henry Newman back in 1851. And the occasion for that was to celebrate the re-establishment of the English hierarchy after 300 years of exile. So in 1850, the Catholic hierarchy was re-established after being banished from the country when Caesar, otherwise known as Henry VIII, declared himself head of the church. So there was a period of 300 years of persecution. Now, from the 1530s, with the martyrdom of St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher, the Carthusians and others, from the 1530s right up to the 1680s, there was a period of 150 years of martyrdoms where Catholic priests were put to death merely for being Catholic priests, and actually a very brutal form of execution, hanging, drawing and quartering. And as I've just had my dinner, and some of you just had yours, I'm not going to give you the gory details of how to kill someone by the process of hanging, drawing and quartering, but it's one of the most gruesome ways of killing a human being imaginable. And it says something for the perverse imaginations of people that thought that was a suitable punishment for a Catholic priest in England. It was also punishment by death to actually be, to harbour or hide a Catholic priest in England during that period. So we have martyrs such as, for instance, Saint Margaret Clitheroe, who was crushed to death for hiding Catholic priests, harbouring Catholic priests and refusing to give the location of Catholic priests. And she was pregnant at the time, she was a mother of young children. So in crushing her to death by just putting increasing weights on her until her rib cage caved in, it was killing not just her but her unborn child. So something the spirit of this merciless secularist England. And then after that 150 years of persecution, there was another 150 years of, shall we say, soft persecution. They were no longer putting people to death, but Catholics were very much second-class citizens with very limited rights, property rights, no right to vote, etc., no right to go to university. So that 300 years of persecution. And then in 1829 was Catholic emancipation. 1845, John Henry Newman, Blessed John Henry Newman, was received into the church. In 1850, the Catholic hierarchy was re-established. In 1851, Newman, if you like, prophesies or sees the restoration of the Catholic hierarchy as a second spring. Okay, so after a long winter, I'm reminded as a lover of C.S. Lewis of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. If you remember The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the wicked witch has made it always winter but never Christmas. Well, England had a 300-year long winter. And then came this second spring. So you get some idea, okay? When we're talking about the liturgy in the second spring, within the context of the 21st century, I want to talk about how the restoration, revitalization, resurrection of the liturgy of the Catholic Church after several decades of abuse is itself a second spring, is itself a resurrection, is itself leading us forward into a time of renewal and growth for the church. And in this, I see Pope Benedict XVI being in the same position as Blessed John Henry Newman in actually being the herald of this second spring. So this talk tonight about the liturgy in the second spring is going to concentrate on Pope Benedict's role in the restoration of the Catholic liturgy after years of liturgical abuse, which is contrary to the Catholic understanding of what the liturgy is. And I think it's very symbolic, by the way, and obviously as an Englishman I'm partisan here, that Pope Benedict came to England on a papal visit in order to beatify Blessed John Henry Newman. Newman was a huge influence on Benedict. There's a connection between the two men, but on all sorts of levels. Benedict, as a philosopher and a theologian, was hugely influenced by Newman's other works. But I want to suggest a parallel between Newman's scenario, Newman's situation in 1851, with his preaching of this sermon, but more important than that really, Newman being who Newman was. Because Newman's conversion and reception into the church in 1845 was really the birth of the Catholic revival in England. And I'm going to talk about that more tomorrow, and that's the connection of that to the liturgy tomorrow. So I'm not going to say too much about that now, except to say that the birth of that revival, which was going to be hugely influential upon not just the resurrection of the faith in England, but the resurrection of the faith in the English-speaking world, and indeed the renewal of the faith throughout the world, regardless of language. And I'll explain that, the importance of that revival to the universal church throughout the world, globally, tomorrow. But I'm seeing Pope Benedict's role, if you like, in the 21st century and the late 20th century as being similar as a pivotal influence to Blessed John Henry Newman's. So, in April 1869, Pope Paul VI promulgated the revised rite of Mass, popularly known as the Novus Ordo, heralding changes in the Church's liturgical practice that were not welcomed by all Catholics, confusing some and angering others. Cardinal Ratzinger welcomed the publication of the new missal because he hoped that the promulgation of a binding liturgical text would put an end to a period of experimentation that had often deformed the liturgy. They are his words. In fact, of course, the period of experimentation would continue, becoming weirder and wackier as self-styled liturgists became ever more innovative in the so-called spirit of Vatican II. For these manic modernists intent on destroying the traditional Mass, ad orientem was anathema, and the only Latin permitted was ad libitum, in other words, ad lib. The only Latin you're allowed is to make it up as you go along. Although Ratzinger had welcomed the Missal of Paul VI in the hope and expectation that it would put an end to the liturgical anarchy, he was nonetheless dismayed that its publication was accompanied by an almost total prohibition of the Missal that had been used by the whole Church up until then. A transitional period of only 6 months was permitted for clergy around the world to conform to the new Missal and to ban and abandon the old. The enforcement of the revised liturgy to the complete exclusion of the old rite almost overnight was further evidence of the intolerance of the modernists towards authentic tradition. Quote, "I was dismayed by the prohibition of the old Missal," Ratzinger wrote, "since nothing of the sort had ever happened in the entire history of the liturgy." End quote. As well as being a great philosopher and a great theologian, he was also a very knowledgeable historian, particularly the history of the Church. Although advocates of the Novus Ordo claim that the sudden break with the past was normal and permissible because Pius V had similarly broken with tradition in 1570, with the promulgation of a new missal in connection with the Council of Trent, from which the Tridentine Mass got its name, Ratzinger illustrated this was not the case. Demonstrating a grasp of history to match his grasp of theology and philosophy, he confuted the historical misperception and deception of the modernists by showing the context of the Council of Trent's promulgation of the Missale Romanum. In the confusion of the Reformation, Ratzinger wrote, it was difficult in many parts of Europe to distinguish between authentic Catholic practice of the liturgy and the various reformed versions that were being practiced. It was therefore decided that the Missal of the City of Rome was to be introduced wherever such confusion reigned as a guarantor of authentic Catholic liturgical practice. Significantly, however, the Missale Romanum did not supplant those liturgies that were at least 200 years old and therefore already bona fide expressions of authentic Catholicism. In other words, and to put the matter bluntly, the Church of the Counter-Reformation, besieged by the real threat of the Protestant Reformation in many parts of Christendom, was more tolerant of genuine liturgical pluralism within the Catholic tradition than were the draconian modernists who had sought to destroy the old rite overnight. Quote, the prohibition of the Missal that was now decreed, a Missal that had known continuous growth over the centuries, starting with the sacramentaries of the ancient church, introduced a breach into the history of the liturgy whose consequences could only be tragic. And that's Pope Benedict's words, well, Cardinal Ratzinger's words. It had been reasonable and right of the Second Vatican Council to order a revision of the Missal in the manner in which it had been revised throughout history, Ratzinger continued. But what had happened had been much more far-reaching. Using the metaphor of a building, he stated that the old building had been demolished and another built in its place. Even though the new building was built largely from materials salvaged from the old one, the true reform of the liturgy should have been a renovation of the existing building, not its demolition. Very, very strident words by Cardinal Ratzinger there. A similar metaphor to describe the inner integrity of tradition was employed by G.K. Chesterton and J.R.R. Tolkien, who likened it to the inner development of a tree. I'll talk about this tomorrow, but I thought I'd mention it now because I think this is very important. An understanding of tradition and its role in the life of the church, we get it in for instance, in Blessed John Henry Newman's Doctrine on the Development of Doctrine, an essay on the development of doctrine. But the way it's explained metaphorically by these great writers, Chesterton and Tolkien, Chesterton says Chesterton was very much engaged in the debate with modernism, even before he became a Catholic. There was a modernist movement in the Catholic Church at the turn of the 20th century. And Sir Pius X was very strident in his condemnation of modernism. Modernism basically is that the church needs to be up to date with what's happening in the world. And Chesterton really answered that by saying, we don't want a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. Very big difference. But both Chesterton talked about the fact that authentic tradition can be likened to a tree. That the tree grows, and it grows through time. In the church, in the sense of understanding the Catholic Church, if you like, as the tree of life, it's grown through 20 centuries. And the further it reaches out, its branches in every century, actually responding to so-called new things, which are usually just old sins in disguise, such as the French Revolution or communism or Nazism or industrialism, just to talk about the last 200 years, or the Protestant Reformation, the various heresies throughout the history of the church. The more that the church grows like a tree, the more it needs to cling to its roots. The bigger the tree gets, the more important the roots become. And although the tree is always the same tree, it is growing through time. And Chesterton compares that to the cloud, the philosophy of the cloud, which is modernism or relativism. Modernism, by the way, when I'm using the word modernism in this talk, I talk about modernism in the theological understanding of the word, not modernism in terms of literature or the arts. It's a different discussion, okay? But modernism, theologically speaking, is basically the church needs to be modern. It needs to modernize to conform itself to the secular culture. And Chesterton, so modernism in that sense is like a type of relativism. The church changes with the changing of the time. And Chesterton referred to that as the philosophy of the cloud. It's formless, it's blown around by winds of fashion, has no roots, no authentic essence. Now, Tolkien even more powerfully, I think, put it this way, talking about the mania, as he put it, for the early church, because basically the modernists in the church had two grounds for abandoning the traditional liturgy. One, a claim, which Benedict shows is false, largely false, that the Novus Ordo was closer to the liturgy of the early church. So in other words, a primitivism, that the church was pure in the early days and becomes corrupt. Notice the parallel with the Protestant understanding of ecclesial history. The primitivism and then the modernism, that basically the church just needs to move with, get with the times, basically. And these two forces were pincer movement. But Tolkien said that you can't understand the mania of the early church, the belief that a sapling is superior to the full-grown tree. And that's a very powerful image, right? The tree, which is the church, is 2,000 years old. It's grown, it has experience of 2,000 years of history. So why the mania that the sapling is superior to the full-grown tree? But he said that even if it were true that the sapling is superior to the full-grown tree, if you chop down the tree looking for the sapling, you don't find the sapling, you kill the tree. Brilliance by Tolkien. Chesterton and Tolkien, like Ratzinger, were tradition-oriented Catholics who would be expected to understand tradition in the manner that thus expressed. More surprising, perhaps, was the manner in which even the wider secular culture rose up in protest against the wanton iconoclasm carried out by the modernists within the church. This is actually very important for us to know this, and to put ourselves in the position of the wider secular culture. Non-believers, seeing what was happening to the liturgy of the church. On July the 6th, 1971, the London Times published the text of an appeal to preserve the Mass, signed by an array of celebrities and dignitaries of various religious faiths or none, which was being sent to the Vatican. Listen to this 3-paragraph letter. Actually, 5-paragraph letter. If some senseless decree were to order the total or partial destruction of basilicas or cathedrals, then obviously it would be the educated, whatever their personal beliefs, who would rise up in horror to oppose such a possibility. Now, the fact is that basilicas and cathedrals are built so as to celebrate a rite which, until a few months ago, constituted a living tradition. We are referring to the Roman Catholic Mass. Yet, according to the latest information available in Rome, there is a plan to obliterate that Mass by the end of the current year. We're not at the moment considering the religious or spiritual experience of millions of individuals. The rite in question, in its magnificent Latin text, has also inspired a host of priceless achievements in the arts. Not only mystical works, but works by poets, philosophers, musicians, architects, painters, and sculptors in all countries and epochs. Thus, it belongs to universal culture as well as to churchmen and formal Christians. In the materialistic and technocratic civilization that is increasingly threatening the life of mind and spirit in its original creative expression, the word, it seems particularly inhuman to deprive man of word forms in one of their most grandiose manifestations. The signatories of this appeal, which is entirely ecumenical and non-political, have been drawn from every branch of modern culture in Europe and elsewhere. They wish to call to the attention of the Holy See the appalling responsibility it would incur in the history of the human spirit were it to refuse to allow the traditional Mass to survive, even though this survival took place side by side with other liturgical forms. That's the letter. In a bizarre role reversal, the signatories of this petition represented a secular David defending sacred tradition against the Goliath-like power of the modernists in the Catholic hierarchy, the latter of whom had cast themselves in the role of heedless and heartless Philistines. Now, you need to be a history of 20th century culture, a historian of 20th century culture, to know the names of these people. Believe me, and I'm studying this period is really my sphere of competence. All of these names were household names at the time. If I read them out now, half of them you probably wouldn't have heard of. But names which you probably have heard of that were on the list: Agatha Christie, Sir Kenneth Clarke, and if ever you've ever seen his beautiful television series Civilization, well, if you haven't, you need to. Father Robert Barron, Bishop Robert Barron's series on civilization in a similar sort of spirit to this earlier one. Robert Graves, the poet, Graham Greene, the novelist, Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist, Malcolm Muggeridge, Iris Murdoch, and say many, many others. There is no doubt whatever that Joseph Ratzinger would have agreed wholeheartedly with those who signed the appeal to the Vatican. He understood all too well the ways in which the arguments of modernist theologians had been used by progressive liturgists as a weapon to destroy the traditional Mass. 25 years later, he would look back wistfully at the disastrous fruits of the ill-conceived and destructive liturgical modernism, stating that he was, quote, convinced that the crisis in the Church that we are experiencing today is to a large extent due to the disintegration of the liturgy, end quote. Later still, he would make it his mission to disarm the modernists of their weapons of mass destruction. Do you like that? Weapons of mass destruction. And would play a major role in the restoration of liturgical tradition. There is little doubt that one of the richest gifts that Ratzinger has bequeathed to the Church is his tireless work in both word and deed to restore the splendour of the liturgy. As far back as 1975, only 10 years after the Second Vatican Council, Ratzinger was writing of the need to oppose the, quote, rationalistic relativism confusing claptrap and pastoral infantilism, strong words, which were degrading the liturgy, quote, to the level of a parish tea party and the intelligibility of the popular newspaper, end quote. Chesterton, again I might talk about this tomorrow, Chesterton said in 1931 that the coming peril is not communism, but the standardisation by a low standard. In other words, the vulgarisation of culture to a lowest common denominator of the banal. In 1984, almost 10 years after these strident words were first written, Ratzinger was asked whether he still stood by what he had said. Absolutely, he replied, adding that things had deteriorated further in the intervening years, so that many more liturgical treasures had been squandered away. There were, however, signs that the tide was turning. When he had written those words, many of his fellow theologians had been, quote, upset or at least surprised, end quote, by what he had said. Whereas now, quote, many of those people admit that I was right. Again, there's a line from a Chesterton poem, The Ballad of the White Horse, where the pagans advance as far as they're going to into Catholic England, and then Alfred the Great and his army turn them back. And there's a line, the high tide, King Alfred cried, the high tide and the turn. Now, when that high tide was, I sometimes say that the tide turned when I became a Catholic in 1989, but that's obviously not true. I hope I had a tiny little part to help the tide along. But perhaps we can say the election of John Paul II in 1978 was the turning of the tide. So yeah, those earlier words by Ratzinger were said in 1975. The appraisal of them was in 1984, by which time, of course, St. John Paul II had become Pope. Continuing his attack on the iconoclasm and vandalism of the liturgical modernists, Ratzinger had written in 1981 that, quote, "One shudders at the lackluster face of the post-conciliar liturgy as it has become, or one is simply bored with its hankering after banality and its lack of artistic standards," end quote. Doesn't mince his words, does he? The problem was, quote, "the contrast between what the authentic text of Vatican II says and the way in which it has been understood and applied," end quote. In other words, there's a difference between what the Second Vatican Council actually taught and what people did in its name, in the so-called spirit of Vatican II, which is normally anything but the true spirit of the Second Vatican Council. Most notably, the disappearance of the use of Latin from the liturgy was in clear contravention of the specific teaching of the Council in Sacrosanctum Concilium, which stated unequivocally that, quote, "the Latin language is to be preserved in the liturgy, and that care must be taken to ensure that the faithful may be able to say or sing in Latin those parts of the ordinary of the Mass which pertain to them," end quote. So these are the documents of the Second Vatican Council. The same document also insisted that, quote, "in accordance with the age-old tradition of the Latin Rite, the Latin language is to be retained by clerics in the divine office," end quote. Having referenced the Council's explicit teaching on the requirement for the retention of Latin within the liturgy and the divine office, Ratzinger cited the abandonment of Latin by fashion-oriented liturgists as another case of the, quote, "all too frequent contradiction between what the Council actually says and the actions carried out by modernists in its name." The overarching consequence of the liturgical vandalism of the post-conciliar period was the universal dumbing down of the liturgy to the lowest common denominator of populist vulgarity. It is strange, Ratzinger observed, that the post-conciliar pluralism has created uniformity in one respect at least. It will not tolerate a high standard of expression. So anything's allowed as long as it's bad. One is reminded indeed of Chesterton's prophecy more than 50 years earlier in Culture and the Coming Peril, that the coming peril was standardization by a low standard. Chesterton was referring to the triumph of the trite and the trivial in secular culture and its servile pursuit of the follies of fads and fashions. He could not have perceived in the 1930s that such narcissistic nonsense would penetrate to the very heart of the Church's worship. The liturgy was not merely entertainment, Ratzinger insisted, nor was it dependent on, quote, "brilliant producers and talented actors," end quote. Its power, quote, "does not come from what we do, but from what is taking place, something which all of us together cannot make." This is continuing the quote. "In the liturgy, there is a power and energy at work which not even the Church as a whole can generate. What it manifests is the holy other, coming to us through the community, which is hence not sovereign but servant, purely instrumental," end quote. The anarchic way in which self-styled liturgists had tampered with the rubrics of the Mass had transformed the majesty and mystery of the liturgy into what Ratzinger described as a, quote, "do-it-yourself patchwork," which had trivialized it, adapting it to our mediocrity. Part of the problem was a selective and defective understanding of the Council's teaching that the faithful should have an actuoso participatio, an active participation in the liturgy. This was taken to mean that liturgy should be full of physical action, such as singing, speaking, reading, preaching, processioning, shaking hands, holding hands, raising hands, a sort of dust storm in a desert. They're my words, not his, don't you start. But these are his words. It was forgotten that the Council also included silence under actuoso participatio. That's a handful. Silence facilitates a really deep personal participation, allowing us to listen inwardly to the Lord's word. Many liturgies now lack any trace of this silence. Many liturgies also lacked any trace of beauty, especially in the way in which traditional sacred music, such as Gregorian chant or polyphony, had been abandoned and banished in deference to what Ratzinger termed utility music, new songs, catchy tunes, and other ditty, that's his words, and these are mine, don't want to stop putting words in his mouth, and other ditties to the deity, which rarely ascended above the level of the banal. Quote, the only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments. I love these words. Namely, the saints the church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. End quote. In quote, the splendour of holiness and art, the church bears witness to the truth through the good and the beautiful. Continuing the quote, if the church is to continue to transform and humanise the world, how can she dispense with beauty in her liturgies? That beauty which is so closely linked with love and with the radiance of the resurrection. The church needed to be a place where beauty and hence truth is at home. The absence of such beauty and its eclipse by the shadow of ugliness would be disastrous. Without such beauty, the world will become the first circle of hell. And they're his words. Good way of getting exercise and getting a drink. I get thirsty by the time I've gone there, come back again is the trouble. Referring to one of the most famous of the modernist theologians who had confessed himself brazenly to be a barbarian, Ratzinger insisted on the inextricable connection between blindness to beauty and blindness to truth. A theologian who does not love art, poetry, music and nature can be dangerous. Blindness and deafness toward the beautiful are not incidental. They necessarily are reflected in theology. End quote. One can hardly hear the future Pope's admonishment without Lorenzo's words in The Merchant of Venice coming to mind. The man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. The motions of his spirit are dull as night, and his affections dark as Erebus. Let no such man be trusted. Mark the music. Without going off on a long tangent, which I don't have time for here, Shakespeare here is alluding to Puritanism. He was rampant in his own time and would eventually succeed in closing down the theatres. One might add to Lorenzo's words, within the present context, that no such man should be entrusted with the reform of the liturgy. Ratzinger's plaintive musings throughout the 1970s and 1980s were indicative of his ongoing concern for the state of the liturgy in the post-conciliar period. These concerns will be expressed much more expansively and definitively in The Spirit of the Liturgy, published in 2000. A healthy liturgy, Ratzinger wrote, was necessary for a healthy society. Whereas law was, quote, essential for freedom and community, worship was essential for law. It is only when man's relationship with God is right that all of his other relationships, his relationships with his fellow men, his dealings with the rest of creation, can be in good order, end quote. See how important Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, sees the liturgy as being. If we get that right, we start to transform the whole of society into an ordered, loving society. If we get that wrong, and we're wrong at the very heart of things. This is as true of man's relationship with himself as it is of his relationship with others. This is me, by the way. Without a life properly ordered and oriented towards God in worship, man becomes disordered and disoriented in himself, flailing and fumbling his way in the darkness and unfathomable depths of the unknowable ego. If man will not lose himself in God, he will lose himself in his self. There is no third course. Worship, wrote Ratzinger, the right kind of relationship with God, is essential for the right kind of human existence in the world, end quote. It allows heavenly light to fall into our world. It lays hold in advance of a more perfect life, and in so doing gives our present life its proper measure. A life without such anticipation, a life no longer opened up to heaven, would be empty. A leaden life. They were his words. In thus allowing heavenly light to shine on our world, it simultaneously allows our fallen world to rise to heaven with the resurrected Christ, who is himself the temple of worship, the living body which stands in the presence of God. Quote, into this body he incorporates men. It is the tabernacle that no human hands have made, the place of true worship of God, which casts out the shadow and replaces it with reality. The body of Christ is sacrificed, and precisely as sacrificed is living. This is the mystery made known in the Mass. Christ communicates himself to us and thus brings us into a real bond with the living God. They were his words. The Church's understanding of the eternal power of the liturgy, expressed so eloquently by Ratzinger, goes far beyond the modernist notions of the Mass as being merely a meal or a gathering of the people of God. Quote, the foundation of the liturgy, its source and support, is the historical pasch of Jesus, his cross and resurrection. This once-for-all event has become the ever-abiding form of the liturgy, end quote. The crucified and resurrected Christ is truly present in the liturgy, not merely as a pious memory to be cherished or revered by the faithful, but as a real presence who transforms those in communion with him. One of the major causes of disorientation in the liturgy following the reforms of Vatican II was the disorientation of the priest during the Mass. Whereas it had been customary for the priest to face the same way as the people towards the east ad orientem, the liturgical modernists turned the priest around so that he faced the opposite way to the people, versus populum, turning his back on the east. Instead of the priest and the people being united in praise, facing the same way, the priest now faced the people and became the central focus of the liturgical performance. He was now the star of the show, with the sanctuary being transformed into the stage on which he performed. This is now Ratzinger speaking. Now the priest, the presider, as they now prefer to call him, becomes the real point of reference for the whole liturgy. Everything depends on him. We have to see him, to respond to him, to be involved in what he is doing. His creativity sustains the whole thing. Less and less is God in the picture. More and more important is what is done by the human beings who meet here and do not like to subject themselves to a predetermined pattern. The turning of the priest toward the people has turned the community into a self-enclosed circle. In its outward form, it no longer opens out on what lies ahead and above, but is closed in on itself. That this is narcissistic. That's the end of the quote. At its worst, the liturgy had ceased to be Christocentric, but had become narcissistically anthropocentric, man-centered. A reflection of man's idolatrous worship of himself. This was not as it should be, prompting Ratzinger to stress the need for a reorientation of priest and people towards Christ. Quote, Christians look toward the east, the rising sun, he wrote. This is not a case of Christians worshipping the sun, but of the cosmos speaking of Christ. End quote. As steeped in the history of the church as he was in her theology and philosophy, he stressed that praying towards the east was regarded as being an apostolic tradition in the early church. Although it wasn't possible to know the exact date when this orientation took place in the Christian church's worship, quote, it was certain that it goes back to the earliest times and was always regarded as an essential characteristic of Christian liturgy and indeed of private prayer. Ratzinger then summarised succinctly the cosmological significance of the orientation of Christian worship. Quote, the fact that we find Christ in the symbol of the rising sun is the indication of a Christology defined eschatologically. Praying toward the east means going to meet the coming Christ. The liturgy, turned toward the east, affects entry, so to speak, into the procession of history toward the future, the new heaven and the new earth which we encounter in Christ. It is the prayer of hope, the prayer of the pilgrim as he walks in the direction shown us by the life, passion and resurrection of Christ. End quote. Reminding us that the Second Vatican Council has said nothing about turning toward the people. In other words, this is not in the Second Vatican Council. Ratzinger asserted that, quote, wherever possible, we should definitely take up again the apostolic tradition of facing the east, both in the building of churches and in the celebration of the liturgy, end quote. In particular, quote, a common turning to the east during the Eucharistic prayer remains essential. Looking at the priest has no importance. What matters is looking together at the Lord. It is now not a question of dialogue, but of common worship, of setting off toward the one who is to come. What corresponds with the reality of what is happening is not the closed circle, but the common movement forward, expressed in a common direction for prayer. End quote. At the heart of the liturgical modernism was a wrong-headed primitivism that presumed not only the so-called purity of the early church, but also that the subsequent history of the church had been nothing but a process of decay. Modern liturgiology tended to canonize antiquity and regarded everything developed later in the Middle Ages and through the Council of Trent as decadent, and they were Ratzinger's words there. Last line. A consequence of this modernist theory of church decadence, remarkably similar to Protestantism in its misunderstanding of ecclesiological development, was an iconoclastic disregard for any authentic tradition and the destruction of everything in the liturgy considered to lack the primitive purity of early liturgical practice. The dubious reconstruction of the most ancient practice had led ultimately to the rejection of authentic development and, quote, the disintegration of the liturgy that has evolved in a living way. I already mentioned about Tolkien and Chesterton's reference to the metaphor of the tree in this regard. Once this is understood, the sheer vandalism of modernism becomes starkly apparent. In the mistaken belief that the sapling is superior to the full-grown tree, the modernists attempt to chop down the tree in search of the sapling. Were their erroneous and heretical experiment to prove successful, they would only succeed in killing the tree and would not, of course, discover the sapling, which has ceased to exist, at least in the temporal sphere. In terms of philosophy, this sort of modernism can be likened to the noble savagery of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who believed that civilization was itself a decadent influence which needed to be destroyed so that the presumed primitive purity of man might emerge. It is no coincidence that Rousseau's philosophical iconoclasm led to the ignoble savagery of the French Revolution, or that the modernist liturgical iconoclasm led to the chaos and anarchy of the post-conciliar period. The disastrous consequences of Rousseau's faulty anthropology and modernism's faulty ecclesiology should serve as a warning to all who seek a return to a pure and primitive garden from which man has long since been exiled and to which he cannot return through his own anthropocentric and godless labours. The godlessness and anthropocentricity that modernism shared with Rousseau was also evident in the bizarre form of modernist clericalism, which led to the priest replacing the cross as the centre of attention during Mass, and in the redesigning of churches. Quote, Ratzinger again, moving the altar cross to the side to give an uninterrupted view of the priest is something I regard as one of the truly absurd phenomena of recent decades, wrote Ratzinger. Is the cross disruptive during Mass? Is the priest more important than the Lord? This mistake should be corrected as quickly as possible. The Lord is the point of reference. He is the rising sun of history. End quote. Even more pernicious than the removal of the cross or crucifix from the altars and sanctuaries of post-conciliar churches was the removal of the Lord himself. What better proof is there of the disastrous disorientation of the post-conciliar madness than the removal of the tabernacle from the sanctuary and its being relegated to side altars, or in some cases removed entirely from the main body of the church and placed in separate rooms or even separate buildings? What better proof of the godless anthropocentricity and disordered clericalism of modernism than the setting up of a throne for the priest in the place of the tabernacle, at the centre of the sanctuary, so that the priest and not the real presence of Christ becomes the central focus. Apart from the egocentric elevation of the priest instead of the host, which such disorientation represents, the removal of the tabernacle indicated a lack of faith in the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. A further manifestation of this loss of faith in the reality of the Eucharist was evident in the wholesale abandonment of adoration and benediction in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. For modernist Catholics, the Mass was no longer a sacrifice, but a meal, and the Blessed Sacrament no longer the body of Christ under the appearance of bread, but merely bread that reminded us of Christ. Ratzinger's rebuttal of this sacrilegious desacralizing of the Eucharist is so brilliant that I need to step aside and let the words of the future Pope speak for themselves. Unfortunately, he's not going to speak for himself, so I'm going to have to speak for him. But hang on. So the following is all Cardinal Ratzinger's words. So let no one say the Eucharist is for eating, not looking at. It is not ordinary bread, as the most ancient of tradition constantly emphasize. Eating it, as we have just said, is a spiritual process involving the whole man. Eating it means worshipping it. Eating it means letting it come into me so that my I is transformed and opens up into the great we, so that we become one in him. Thus, adoration is not opposed to communion, nor is it merely added to it. No, communion only reaches its true depths when it is supported and surrounded by adoration. The Eucharistic presence in the tabernacle does not set another view of the Eucharist alongside or against the Eucharistic celebration, but simply signifies its complete fulfillment. For this presence has the effect, of course, of keeping the Eucharist forever in church. The church never becomes a lifeless space, but is always filled with the presence of the Lord, which comes out of the celebration, leads us into it, and always makes us participants in the cosmic Eucharist. What man of faith has not experienced this? A church without the Eucharistic presence is somehow dead, even when it invites people to pray. But a church in which the eternal light is burning before the tabernacle is always alive, is always something more than a building made of stones. In this place, the Lord is always waiting for me, calling me, wanting to make me Eucharistic. In this way, he prepares me for the Eucharist, sets me in motion toward his return. Brilliant words of Cardinal Ratzinger. Another distinct and disturbing feature of liturgical modernism is its disdain for kneeling. If it is true, as indeed it is, that every knee should bow at the name of Jesus, it is surely perverse that modernism refuses to kneel or bow before the Lord. The removal of altar rails and kneelers from churches is a sure sign of spiritual apostasy. Once again, in the case of kneeling, as in all other aspects of the spirit of the liturgy, Cardinal Ratzinger rings forth like a carry-on of light and life amidst the darkness and death of modernity. Conceding with the modernists that kneeling may indeed be alien to today's culture, he adds that such a culture is not a true culture in any true sense. Quote, "For this culture has turned away from the faith and no longer knows the one before whom kneeling is the right, indeed the intrinsically necessary gesture. The man who learns to believe learns also to kneel, and a faith or a liturgy no longer familiar with kneeling would be sick at the core. Where it has been lost, kneeling must be rediscovered, so that in our prayer we remain in fellowship with the apostles and martyrs, indeed in union with Jesus Christ himself. And from the brilliance of Cardinal Ratzinger to that other great authority on theology, I'm talking about Bono of U2, from the sublime to the almost ridiculous. There is in one of his songs, one of my favourite lines in all modern music: if you want to kiss the sky, you have to learn how to kneel. A close ally of the holy gesture of kneeling in the liturgy is the necessity of holy silence, the tranquil space within which contemplation and meditation are possible. Ratzinger insisted that, quote, silence is part of the liturgy, end quote. Although singing and praying out loud is an appropriate response to our engagement with the divine liturgy, the presence of the greater mystery surpassing all words summons us to silence. They were his words. So, just to conclude with some words of my own. Even as Cardinal Ratzinger was summoning the faithful to silence in prayer, his masterful book on the spirit of the liturgy was calling them to action. Even as he called the faithful to kneel for communion, he was exhorting them to stand and fight for the ancient traditions of the Church's worship. Here at last was a leading figure in the Church, the closest ally of St. John Paul II, who was prepared to take the fight to the monsters of modernity. Like a modern St. George coming to the defence of the bride of Christ, a true damsel in distress, he wielded his sword of truth and lance of reason in a battle to the death with the dragon of disorientation. Thank you very much.